Okay, 4 more movies to go. 4 more movies that are going to be like the 4 before it and the 4 before that. So let's go ahead and watch another generic formulaic slash movie.
Never mind.
I don't want to scare anyone, but I'm going to give it to you straight about Jason.
Did you know that a young boy drowned?
Legend has it that Jason saw his mother beheaded that night, and he took his revenge. A revenge that he'll continue to seek if anyone ever enters his wilderness again.
So, Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, tells the story of a studio that finally got the rights to the franchise but couldn't make a Freddy vs. Jason movie yet, so we got this instead. Welcome back to my Friday the 13th series review, guys. We have arrived to one of the most infamous and controversial movies of the franchise, which is saying a lot, really, in retrospect. This movie is often accused of being the worst of the franchise, and if not the worst, then somewhere always almost in the, bottom 3. And the main reason for that, among others, is the fact that Jason is barely in the movie. Yeah, apparently New Line Cinemas didn't get the memo from Friday the 13th Part 5. Fans want Jason. They don't want a copycat. They don't want some body-possessing, mystical, spiritual, demon, whatever thing that looks like Elmer from Brain Damage. No, they want Jason Voorhees. Simple as that. In fact, this is one of 2 Friday the 13th movies that I had not seen before starting this review series, because Jason infamously has no presence almost at all in this movie, and he's the reason I got into the franchise, so why would I even bother? But because I started this review series without thinking ahead at all, I went ahead and finally watched this movie, this weird-ass movie, and I'm here to give my thoughts and review and rant about how this is absolutely one of the most underrated movies of the franchise. I'm not joking. Yep, can feel about half of you clicking that dislike button right there. But I don't know what to say, guys. I found this movie to be supremely entertaining, especially compared to, Part 8? No, this beats that, by a fucking mile. And I'm not talking a so bad that it's good kind of entertaining either. I think there is legitimate enjoyment to be had with Jason Goes to Hell. Admittedly, I do kind of have a soft spot for these types of sequels in general, the ones that are so radically different from the others that they don't even feel like they're part of the same franchise. Because I get it, you don't want to be redundant, you don't want to try to copy, the other movies to try and achieve their level of success. You want to make your own movie. You want to make your own brand on this franchise. I don't know how many people would agree with this, but I would definitely rather something be too different than too similar, if that makes any sense. This movie is like if Halloween 3 tried to include Michael Myers in the first 5 minutes, killed him off, then continued with the rest of the movie. And on that basis, I totally get the hate for this movie because, unlike Halloween 3, it actually tricks you into thinking it will be a Jason movie. That's perfectly exemplified with the opening scene. You have this woman coming in to Crystal Lake, going into her cabin, about to take a shower, of course. And then Jason pops out, he chases her into the woods, but it turns out that she was an FBI agent who lured him into an ambush where they blow him up. And I mean they blow him up. Admittedly, the opening credits themselves are kind of weird because they always feel like... As I was saying, it feels like the opening credits are actually... Okay, dude, serious? Anyways, but the opening credits aside, I think this is a brilliantly subversive opening for this type of movie. In fact, I will say it's one of the most creative and interesting openings for a slasher movie that I've ever seen. In fact, this whole meta self-aware tone runs throughout the entire movie, really. And that's not them ripping off Scream because this predates Scream. No, this is the filmmakers realizing the type of movie that they're making and deciding to have fun with it, much in a similar vein to Friday the 13th Part 6. Director Adam Marcus knew the risks he was running when he was making this movie. He knew what he was doing, he knew how polarizing and how controversial this would end up being, but at the same time, he was so against making a generic, redundant sequel that he went ahead with it anyways. And you know what? We can argue about whether or not he went too far, but I applaud the man's creative integrity. And while we can argue about whether or not he made a good Friday the 13th movie, he sure as hell made a great horror movie. I mean, you have some gruesome kills, you have some great suspense and atmosphere, and you have some amazing special effects work. I mean, there are some special effects sequences here on par with like the first Hellraiser movie. It is just glorious to watch, especially if you're a fan of that whole era of special effects. And again, we finally have some style and atmosphere injected into the series once again since what, like part 4? Part 4, that's when we had the most atmosphere. And since then, that's not really been the strong suit of any of the movies, but this one. And while we don't really get Jason on screen all that often, when we do, I think he looks badass. I think that monstrous design of his is so wonderfully, like, just messed up and just so deformed, just so beyond human, like this perversion. Kane Hodder is fine in the role of Jason, of course, in the little screen time he has as the character. But one thing about his performance and the overall portrayal here that I just don't like at all are the weird grunting noises that Jason makes when he's being attacked. What? That is the one element of this movie that I would say is comically bad. Jason's physical absence is missed throughout the movie for me. I mean, swapping out one of cinema's greatest horror icons for a snobby reporter and a middle-aged police officer, it doesn't have the same punch, you know? That being said, there are some great action sequences throughout this movie. I mean, you get to see Jason raid, well, you don't see Jason raid, but you get to see Jason raid a police station Terminator style, and that is a pretty great sequence unto itself. Then you have the sequence over at a diner when all the waiters and waitresses and cooks are just like taking everything they have and just unleashing it on Jason. Something that goes criminally underappreciated, in my opinion, are the characters. And they're what really allow me to become invested in the story that we get here, because otherwise I think this would be a convoluted mess that would be nigh unwatchable. This isn't about some horny teenagers who are trying to get laid at a cabin while they're being stalked by Jason and they're too dumb to notice. This is about a man who's trying to win back the love of his life and trying to prove his ability as both a husband and a father. And I think that is wonderfully endearing, especially for this franchise. And that's so much more easy to engage with and to follow than the same, like, I want to get laid storyline that we've had in the past 8 movies. In fact, you know, I'll go and say that Stephen is one of my favorite characters of the franchise. He is so instantly likable and relatable. He's goofy, but not to the point of being obnoxious or annoying. He's an everyman, he's relatable, like I said, but he rises to the occasion when pushed to the limits. And I think he's incredibly sympathetic, and I really pulled for him all the way. Then we have Jessica, who also rises to the occasion of taking on Jason, despite the grief she's taking on throughout the movie. I mean, everyone this woman knows is either dead or in mortal danger, so the fact that she can still kick Jason's ass and send him to hell, I mean, that's impressive. I don't love the fact that this movie made up relatives for Jason. It seems pretty contrived for the plot, which it is. But at the same time, it's not the worst that I've ever seen in a slasher movie. I mean, I prefer that to what they did in the original Halloween 2. So it's not like that's unforgivably bad on the movie's part. And I cannot talk about the cast without giving some real love to the Duke. Creighton Duke might just be the most badass, awesome, and just plain cool characters ever to be in this series. And yes, the character is only here so he can deliver the most ridiculous exposition that he or anybody else should not be aware of at all. There's a rumor that Adam Marcus is developing a Creighton Duke spin-off movie, which if you've seen this, you know why that's a ridiculous idea. But, if you make that movie, Adam Marcus, I'll be there. One scene I specifically wanted to talk about is the scene between Stephen and Duke, the one where Duke breaks Stephen's fingers. People like to say that this scene doesn't make any sense and that it's just another weird thing in this movie. And I thought so too, until I watched till the end of the scene. This scene isn't just Duke being an asshole, though that is a bonus. But no, this is about Duke testing Stephen's strength, his will. He's trying to see if Stephen is worthy of the knowledge that he's about to pass down to him, because anybody who knows this information and is about to take on the spirit of Jason Voorhees needs to be able to put up with the hell that encompasses. And when Stephen volunteers his fingers to be broken at the end of that scene, you know, instead of shying away, that's when the Duke starts really trusting him and confides in him with this information without any charge, so to speak. So in that way, I think this was a very well-written scene that deserved to be in the movie. For a movie that's as insane and wild and just crazy as this one, you need an engaging, likable cast to really guide you through the havoc that this movie unleashes on you. They need to provide an anchor for the story, for the plot, so that it doesn't get away from the grounded elements of the narrative. It stays true to the human aspects of the story because they're the ones we're following. They're the reason why we're invested in the story, and I actually cared. So because of that, I didn't really mind so much the out-of-place mythology. though making Jason a Deadeye was pretty out of left field, I'll admit. With that being said, let me go ahead and transition to my negatives, because this movie is far from perfect. It is by no means a masterpiece, and even if you watch it as a standalone film, you will still have problems with this movie, some of which might be big enough or glaring enough to inhibit your enjoyment of it. So don't go in thinking that if you remove the Friday the 13th label, that you will have a perfect experience with it, because that's not going to be the case. The main critique for me, the overarching problem I have with this movie, is that while it seems like most of the visuals, most of the odd ideas that Adam Marcus chose to put in here were done because he legitimately thought they would be interesting to share with an audience, a lot of them do seem like they were put in just for the sake of shock value, like just to make it a bit more impressionable, just to make it a bit more provocative. You know, as if this movie needed to be any more provocative than it already is. For a movie as alienating as this one to both fans of the franchise and mainstream audiences, I think to put in these weird, out-of-place scenes just for the sake of being provocative was a huge mistake. It was totally misguided, and I do think it will bring down the enjoyment value for a lot of people. For example, that infamous homoerotic shaving scene. When you watch him talk about this scene in interviews, he will always say the exact same thing, that he put that scene in there because it hadn't been done before, because slasher movies hadn't gone to that place before, because they hadn't been so taboo. I mean, I don't know if that's true or not, you can fact check that, whatever. But obviously his intention was just to put in a scene there that would have people talking about this movie. So to have the scene in there just seems like a cheap device to get this movie to seem more interesting to other audiences who were not prepared for it. And it just comes off as cringy to me, frankly, to have a scene in there that's just in the movie to be edgy, you know, to try and give it a bit more spice. Also, the rules surrounding this whole body possession angle just don't really add up to me. They're always kept very vague. They don't really explain too much about how this is supposed to work. So when Jason goes into another man's body, let me rephrase that. When Jason takes over the body of another person, does his quote-unquote superpowers, you know, his super strength and invulnerability, are those transferred as well? Because that's how it's certainly played out for certain scenes. I mean, you have him going in and doing all these impossible things and surviving all these impossible things. But then there are other scenes when he is easily overpowered by people he would have no trouble taking out otherwise. And he's even like knocked out a couple times, which to me is just odd because that would never happen with the old Jason. So there should have been more consistency in these roles. It shouldn't have just been a contrivance for the plot. And while this movie has some great action sequences, such as the police raid and the scene at the diner, some of the actual fistfights are pretty awkward to watch, especially because they're mostly done in these long shots, these long wide shots where you can see pretty much all of the choreography and all its really stilted, awkward glory. And that does come across a little hokey, more often than not silly. So to see Jason trying to fight a guy half his size and losing towards the end, that doesn't really sit well with me either. But those are my only real negatives with this movie, because otherwise I had a damn good time with it. I don't think this is a hidden gem necessarily. Again, there are going to be problems that everyone will see no matter what you think about this movie, whether or not it's a Friday movie or just its own kind of thing. But at the same time, I would recommend it to somebody who would keep an open mind, because there is some real enjoyment to be had here if you can overlook like the weirdly vague rules, if you can overlook the convoluted mythology, if you can overlook some of those like stilted fight scenes, whatever. You can have a good time with this movie. So if you like this movie, if you're in the minority like me, go ahead and let me know in the comments so I don't feel so alone. And if you're in the majority opinion, go ahead and let me know how wrong I am in the comments, because I always like to be reminded of that. But do not tell me that this is the most stupid Jason movie, because that comes next.